So I wanted to discuss Western esotericism, and the reason I wanted to discuss it with you is I know you've got a really in-depth knowledge of this topic, and for me, I've been on a long sort of spiritual quote unquote journey, and I found myself being quite rootless and drawn in every which direction, pulled to the four quarters, so to speak, and when I suddenly kind of found the Western esoteric teachings, and we can discuss what they are and what that broadly means shortly, I found myself becoming more and more centered and becoming more and more able to build on a sort of foundation and feel like I was part of something. Now, that might well be an illusion that I need to work on, but it does feel like that finding that tradition and learning and growing myself under the kind of umbrella of that idea of Western esotericism has really, really helped me. And when you made a recent podcast about Platonic Orientalism and how it relates to Western esotericism, it really kind of fired me up. And you linked us to the Infinite Fire webinar by the Rittman Library. And that, again, fired me right up. And it's really been able to cement teachings, understandings, foundations, belonging, if you wanted to put a word like that on it. And so I'm really keen to discuss the idea of the concept of Western esotericism with you. So again, I thank you for being here. I wondered, could you please, to begin with, give us a kind of broad outline of what Western esotericism means to you and a kind of history of it, really?
Right. So I suppose I should first say that the idea of Western esotericism is a very nebulous and loose one. And what the general consensus has come to be is that Western esotericism is a kind of waste bin category.
Right.
I don't like framing it in those terms. The way I imagine it is that Western esotericism is the shadow cast by orthodoxy. So if orthodoxy is a kind of giant monolith, and in the Western tradition, this is the Catholic Church sets up the agenda for what is orthodox, and then eventually the Protestants do in their own way. But both of these Christianities cast their own shadows of unorthodoxy. And that is the wellspring from which we draw what we call the Western esoteric tradition. But I think that a key concept in understanding this is that all of this narrative hinges around something called a wisdom tradition. Now, what is wisdom? That's an extremely difficult question to answer. But one way that I like to think about it is that we have knowledge on the one hand, and these are disassociated, disconnected bits of information. And then wisdom is how we take those disassociated bits, we synthesize them, and we put them into practice, into the real world, if you will, into manifestation. And that's essentially what the Western esoteric tradition engages with, is this idea of wisdom traditions. How do we frame all of the knowledge that we've acquired throughout generations and generations of philosophers and scientists and engineers and astronomers and economists and, even soldiers and so forth? How do we take all that knowledge and frame it in a way that we can understand it? That's what a wisdom tradition is all about. And now, the Western esoteric tradition is a dual beast. Let's use as our metaphor the caduceus of Hermes, which has two serpents intertwining around it. Now, the one serpent, we could say, represents the materialist tradition, the atomist tradition, as represented by thinkers like Democritus, or even, to some extent, Aristotle. This is one way of looking at the world. This is, you might call it the alchemical dimension to the Western esoteric tradition. It's concerned with material substances and with redeeming material substances from their fallen state. So, and where this comes from, this idea that material is fallen, is from the other snake, which is the idealist. And the idealist stems from the Platonic tradition. Plato himself took his traditional wisdom, if you will, from various sources: Pythagoras, Orpheus, Zarathustra among the Persians. And he synthesized all of this into a wisdom tradition, which we call today Platonism, and which was then exported on the backs of Macedonian soldiers and mercenaries in Alexander's army, where they took these ideas and they replaced the upper crust of other civilizations, so Egypt, Persia, Bactria, etc. They knocked out the elites and they filled them with Greeks. And these people, they spoke Greek, they were educated in Greek, they had a knowledge of Greek philosophy, which was popular literature. And this Platonic model became the dominant filter through which all of the indigenous traditions from these various places like Egypt and Persia and so forth, Babylon, would be recast. And so that's what we call Platonic Orientalism, if you will. And so the Western esoteric tradition is the examination of these two serpents, if you will, and how they move through history. And it is a shadow of orthodoxy, because orthodoxy prizes one particular type of idealism, which emerged out of Platonism. It was a synthesis of Platonic and Judaic ideas. And so we have this mystical, mystery cult tradition in Christianity, which rises to power. It's mostly among women and slaves that it rises into prominence, and then eventually the aristocracy start becoming patrons of it. They get won over. They establish the governmental structures in places where the former imperial structures were crumbling apart, and the Catholic Church essentially takes over as the government, the only reliable communicating structure that's still functioning in Europe by about the year 500. And so the only works that were copied were the works that fed this tradition. They weren't copying the non-Trinitarian works. They weren't copying the Gnostic texts. They definitely weren't copying the works of the materialists. Even Plato, in his own day, which is, almost 1,000 years earlier, he ignored the materialists. He knew full well about Democritus, but he just chose to kind of skirt it aside. And so all of this kind of comes to culmination in Florence in the late 15th century. And with figures like Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and so forth. And what they were trying to do was gather all of these disparate bits and get them all clumped together into this worldview, which to them was wisdom. They were trying to reclaim the lost wisdom of the ages. And this has always been the project of occultists, of esotericists, of theosophists, and so forth, from Jacob Boehme to Madame Blavatsky. They're all trying to recover lost wisdom. Now, what that wisdom is another story, but it's the pretense to having it, or that it exists and that it has a tradition that can be tapped into. And I think now more related to your personal adventure with Western esotericism, if you feel that the Western esoteric tradition has benefited your life, I don't think that it's because it roots you with an actual tradition, because it's so nebulous. I think what it does is it roots you into a modality where wisdom is a value. You know, so many people in the postmodern world, they're like, oh, what is wisdom? Wisdom is stupid. It's like, there's no such thing. It's just a power game that religious people try to use on you. And there's something to be said about that, but also I think to deny that wisdom is actually a thing is folly. I mean, that's the root of it.
That's interesting. Yeah, there's so much to touch on. It does root you into wisdom being a value, and that's something that you pick up from any of the you know, if you're picking up a Buddhist text, if you're picking up a Vedic text, these ideas are heavily embedded in these texts. But it took me particularly a long time to kind of appreciate that. When I started out on my journey, I'd been a Christian when I was younger, and I was a staunch atheist, quote unquote, but I was really, really unhappy. I mean, I was an alcoholic, for God's sake. And I remember getting into Buddhism and very much ignoring all of the lofty stuff and all of the kind of more insightful philosophical stuff for just the nuts and bolts practical meditation, because that's what really helped me at that time. And so now I'm revisiting books like the Bodhikaya, and it's just speaking to me on so many different levels. And I think that wisdom being the utmost value is present in those teachings, but it's taken me a long time to kind of tease it out through ignorance, a kind of a unwillingness to kind of, I think, an unwillingness to face up to the reality that there is more happening than we're told or that we're led to believe, and that there's possibly some kind of stigma attached to it in this day and age in having a quote unquote faith. I don't like the word faith, because faith implies some kind of blind faith. Yeah, do you know what I mean? And so when you're able to set that aside and you're able to actually say, look, you know, in fact, I talked about this in a recent video. If you want to, you know, grow, you need to, you know, bring yourself down to the level of, we don't know everything. We aren't privy to all the information and all of the available information in the universe, only a small fraction. But we can, through diminishing our egos and ourselves, quote, personalities, quote unquote, we can actually touch into our true selves and become more wise, become privy to more information. And when you go over the text that you've read a while ago and they speak to you again, I find it's really fantastic. And it's, again, that's part of what's enabled me, I think, to become stronger, better, faster, whatever label you want to put on my kind of growth, so to speak. Wisdom definitely plays a key part in that, there is no doubt. I'm interested in touching back on the idea of the caduceus. I really like that analogy.
Right. I should stress that isn't an analogy or whatever. I'm using it as a model. That's not what I think the caduceus means.
No. I realise that. Yeah.
I know you do. I just, for clarity.
Okay. Yeah. Could you just touch on the kind of materialist ideas? Because it's something I've been really fascinated by listening to your Encyclopedia Hermetica talking about Democritus and the atoms in the void. Could you give us just a quick point out the polarity between the materialist and the idealist mindset states, please? Because I think for people who are new to the concept of Western esotericism, having then a grounding in the potential two sides of the coin, so to speak, would be useful.
Right. So to make it as simple as possible, the idealist is the one concerned with the one. And the realist, or let's say the materialist, let's cast this in idealist and materialist terms, because these are categories that are often in parallel, but they are not in perfect parallel. There is overlap at some points. So the materialist is concerned with the many, and the idealist is concerned with the one. We can see this at work in, let's say, the pre-Socratic tradition by looking at, on the one hand, Parmenides, who believes that all is one and everything that, all motion or all change is illusory. And that, on the other hand, we have Heraclitus, who says that everything flows and that all that exists is change. It's the only constant in the universe. So from these kind of schools of thinking, the materialist basically believes that, and I'll say this, the materialist in the ancient classical terms, because it gets really complicated, right? We're getting into physics and chemistry and quantum physics even once we start getting into the 20th century. In the ancient world, the materialists believed that there were atoms cascading in a void, that the world was infinite. There was just an infinite expanse of matter. There was just matter touching and acting upon other material forces. And that through this kind of infinite cascade, that's the image that they use is a cascade, that it's kind of like a waterfall. It changes in its configuration as it falls through space. That because it was infinite, it could produce any number of configurations, and that out of this infinite number of configurations, our existence was bound to happen eventually. And not only that, but our existence is bound to happen again and again and again forever, in every possible detail the same, except for one atom being different in that universe, right? So it's the possibilities are endless. Now, faced with this, the reaction was the idealists. And you could see this with, you can see it starting outside of Greece, but within Greece, it's largely attributed to Pythagoras as a kind of figurehead of it. And then the actual historical codifier of it as a system is Plato. And what he said was that essence precedes existence. Existence, it emanates out of pure essence. It isn't that existence produces essence. It's that the essence is eternal and existence is the temporary, flawed, sort of amorphous, changing, a corruptible thing that flows out of it. So his examples for what the pure essence is, for example, the relation of angles that creates a triangle, right? That is eternal. It never changes. You need a specific set of angles to create a triangle, or rather a relationship of angles. And he says, well, if we look at triangles out in the world, what is it that makes these triangles? Because they're not perfect. It's that they participate in triangle-ness. And obviously, this is one way to do it with shapes, but the most common example used in the classroom is tables, or chairs. Chairs are different. There's all sorts of different kinds of chairs, but they all participate in the form of the chair, of chairness. And that's the pure, immutable form of the chair in the mind of God. And this is where idealism stems from. So he extrapolates this from chairs and so forth to ideals like justice, like piety, like virtue. What are all of these things? How can we come to know them? It's usually by teasing them out, by dialoguing, right? That's how we come to know the truth, by asking questions. And so both of these models are good. it's that most kind of calcified worldviews prioritize one model over another rather than seeing them as like two coexisting traditions that cannot be divorced from one another. There is no idealism without materialism, and there is no materialism without idealism. They are yin and yang, right? And to me, the Western esoteric tradition is a matter of seeing this tension in motion through history. And obviously that's my personal approach to it, because I'm an historian. Other people who are ritual magicians, or I don't know what people do with their lives, but whatever they might do, they might have a different approach to it. But for me, it's an observational lens.
So you've mentioned sort of practical ritual magicians. Where does Hermetics tie into the Western esoteric order?
Right. So Hermeticism is not as popularly conceived of this ancient Atlantean tradition that came down and has been imparted by priests from Thoth to, I don't know, various Egyptian priests for 10,000 years until coming to us. What it is Neoplatonic philosophy of 2nd century Hellenic Alexandria with a veneer of Egyptian and Babylonian aesthetics, if you will. The Corpus Hermeticum is a collection of Gnostic and Neoplatonic texts, which then get recovered during the Renaissance. And it's during the Renaissance that we get this kind of idea of a Hermeticist. And even in the Renaissance, the idea of like who is and who isn't a Hermeticist is kind of like blurry. I haven't come across anybody who actually claims themselves to be a Hermeticist until about the 19th century, I think. So it's not a label that people consciously use for themselves. But what it essentially means is Neoplatonism, and also humanism. So it is a way of looking at the world whereby humans are important again because they are the nexus between the material and the divine. So we have this duality here where you have the material world, it is indeed a thing, but you also have the ideal world. And it's as you say, feet in hell and head in heaven, or something along those lines. You need to experience both, but you need to realize that you are the nexus, that God created humanity to contemplate the universe. And that's how God, enjoys himself. That's what he does. It delights God. And we have to remember that all of this emerges in an extremely Christian context. And you can't actually divorce Hermeticism fully from Christianity. To do so is to kind of create a false retro-projection of Hermeticism as an Egyptian mystery cult, which that stuff factors into Hermeticism, but Hermeticism is more defined by the climate of the 2nd century AD in Egypt than it is by the Old Kingdom of Egypt. But it's a tension at work, you see. So it's like you have these Christians in the Renaissance who they want to be Christians and they want to be good Christians, but they also want to be good humans. And so they're like, okay, well, who can we look back to? Well, let's look back to Cicero. Let's look back to Caesar. Let's look back to all these classical Roman authors and try to, give a rebirth of this worldview. And Hermes is one of these figures who, in this case, Hermes Trismegistus is has overlap with the Greek god Hermes, but he's a different figure altogether when he's received by the church fathers, by people like Marsilio Ficino and Ludovico Lazzarelli and so forth. Ludovico Lazzarelli is a good example. He didn't practice magic. He didn't give a hoot about science. He was a very pious Christian, and he was a poet who tried to write poetry in these ancient pagan modes, but he was also very interested in the wisdom tradition of Kabbalah, of Hermeticism, of Neoplatonism. That's what he was interested in. But he didn't give a hoot about magic. So people's have their imagination of what Renaissance Hermeticism is. It's colored by Francis Yates, Giordano Bruno, and the Hermetic tradition, which is a good book, but it's not without its issues, because it kind of creates a thing that wasn't reified at the time. It wasn't like a self-conscious tradition or society.
So it's interesting you mentioned the Hermeticist looking at man as the bridge between the material world and God, and that's the teaching that's really brought me out of my shell, so to speak, and really, again, given me this rooted feeling. And it is very much a feeling of being a transcendental bridge, operating here in the material world, but having now, it seems, the gift of wisdom from above, and that's the only way I can describe it. It might sound like sort of lofty language to some people, but that is the best way for me to describe it. And when I look back at my life feeling this lack of rooting and this kind of discombobulation, I wonder whether it was down to my shying away from those teachings because of my bad experiences when I was younger. And I started to say bad experiences with Christianity. I just felt silly, and I thought when I was sort of like I'd left school, I knew everything and that I could go off into the world. And it turns out I was pretty wrong. Actually, I didn't do particularly well. It's interesting you talked about the Hermetic side of things being that idealist, materialist bridge, but alchemy, that seems to be just a materialist ideology. Is that a fair summary to make, or does alchemy have an idealist component as well? Because alchemy is something, again, that is in that shadow cast by orthodoxy, and something I think we should touch on here, if you don't mind.
Well, so I would set up a kind of dichotomy between theurgy and alchemy, because theurgy is doing things to make God act, essentially, whereas alchemy is more a matter of torturing matter to reach higher states of perfection. Now, right there, you have idealism built into it. Like, the whole Platonic worldview is deeply intertwined with the alchemical pursuit, because what you're doing is you're taking base metals and you are putting them in various chemical processes, heating them, dissolving them, evaporating them, whatever, and you're noticing the transformations in that material. And what you're trying to do is bump it up into higher and higher and higher states until it ultimately reaches gold. And now what this proves, if you can do this, is that everything is really one thing. Is that, like, all substances are really ultimately one thing. We just have to find what the ground of being is. But we can't find the ground of being without smashing being apart, ripping it apart, torturing it, destroying it, and stripping it down to its base essence and seeing what the world is composed of. So this sort of idea of alchemy was very fashionable in the Middle Ages in Europe, and then it went out of favor because of Dalton's theory that chemicals individual atoms were the most irreducible unit in the universe. But it turns out that the alchemists were really the ones who were right, because you can take beryllium and fire it at 70% of the speed of light and hit it into lead, and you will get gold. Like, these things have been done in the giant hadron colliders, and the alchemical dreams have been realized. Even radium was often thought of as being this transmutational element, because it literally changed into a different substance. And so this proved that, it's not just like carbon and hydrogen and helium and silver and gold and copper and zinc and so forth, that these are the most irreducible units. No, there is like a deeper level to reality. And that's what the alchemists were pursuing. They wanted to prove that everything stemmed from the one great thing. And it was just, variations in the one great thing that created this great multiplicity. And that is a spiritual journey in and of itself, right? Like,
yes.
But you've set up this goal for yourself. They say, finis corona opus. So the end crowns the work. There was an end involved. There was a telos. So this is an ideologically driven pursuit. And they weren't wrong, right? Like they, in continuing their search, they kept getting into deeper and deeper levels of understanding. It's just that we have to factor in like the 20th century and the discoveries of science in the 20th century, that this is a continuation of that process that was begun in the Middle Ages. It's not a break with it.
And so what does Theurgy have to do with alchemy? Because some of the listeners might not be familiar with that term. Would you be able to elaborate on what you mean by Theurgy, please?
Theurgy is a label that scholars use to talk about the kind of devotional activities that occurred in late antiquity. Now, we would just call this like regular plain old devotion in a society that is fully pagan, right? What the aim of Theurgy was usually was offering certain things to statues, trying to animate statues with the presence of the god by bringing the gods down through some sort of like magical offering.
Like sympathetic magic.
Yeah, and that's where it all stems from, right? So the sympathetic magic that was revived in the Renaissance as Sabaean, Hermetic, whatever magic, the kind of stuff that you get in the Picatrix, is just plain old paganism, right? Like,
yeah.
It's just that it has been recast in the shadow of Christianity. So, or in the shadow of Islam, in the shadow of one orthodoxy
Heresy.
Or another. Right. Well, it's the idea that magic is somebody else's religion. And so Theurgy emerges from that, because in late antiquity, around the time of, say, Plotinus, Plotinus himself, he was a so-called pagan. He was a Neoplatonic philosopher, and he thought prayers were kind of silly, because he's like, well, who am I praying to? I'm praying to like the oversoul, which is just kind of like me. So I'm not going to pray to that. And I'm not going to like offer sacrifices, because that's silly. The all doesn't need more of all. It already is all. So there's nothing I can do there. And he kind of just like dismissed these things. He thought that like image magic was weird, like statues were weird. He stripped it down. He was very simple. You could say he's like Zen in a way. I don't want to press that too hard, but he doesn't think in these like Baroque pagan efflorescences of colorful statues that do miracles and require endless trains of devotion from the local women. This kind of thing, Plotinus is like, yeah, I can do without it. And so among the intellectuals, this sort of thing was kind of dying out, and that's why it was easy for them to eventually make the switch over to Christianity, or some kind of Stoic philosophy. And those practices largely started becoming observed with some degree of superstition, and that's where we get the term theurgy. It's from this shift in the way people look at traditional paganism, because we don't hear about theurgy in 300 BC. Nobody uses that term. It doesn't mean anything. That's just people's religion. It's only once we have this kind of fracturing into numerous concrete religions, and then we have people writing from these perspectives that are concretized, that we get words like theurgy.
Just the smell of that fragrance as after you've lit the incense and you're wandering around the yard here, whatever, working. Every time I get that whiff, it's just that, yeah, and it does connect me. I can't deny that, and I think that if it helps people, I think it's a really good practice to get into. Like you rightly say, if you're needing to cultivate these good states of mind, these equanimous modes of being, devotional practice certainly helps. I'm not particularly sure that theurgy is a good starting point myself for people just kind of getting into these ideas, because from my personal experience, it can cause too much change to occur, and too much change can then suddenly become unmanageable, and things can take a strange turn.
Right. And I've talked about this in my lectures on the 7 planets. If you've heard that, my whole introduction to that stuff is just like, this is cool, and have fun with it, but also like there's risks of falling into like your own imagination trap. Like basically you trap yourself in your own imagination. It's possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Changing tack somewhat then, I'm interested to just chat a bit more broadly about Western esotericism. I'm really grateful for all the information you've given us, and it's fantastic to speak to you. Thank you again for being here. Where do things like Buddhism, because we've talked about that, and the Vedic tradition tie in with Western esotericism? Do they come under that umbrella? Is there any influence? Because, I've been practicing Buddhist meditation for years, and it is a definite influence. Does Buddhism and the Vedic teachings tie in? Because you've mentioned Platonic Orientalism before. Is that where the Orientalism that you're talking about? Essentially, is what I'm trying to say.
No, that's a different Orientalism, but it does figure into this particular conversation. What I would say is that we need to use the same model that we were using with esotericism is the shadow of orthodoxy. Because when we understand that, Buddhism and Hinduism as part of Western esotericism makes a lot of sense. Because Buddhism is a completely different tradition from Christianity in every possible way. And it is extremely alluring as well in its fullness, in its view of the world, in its clarity, in everything about it is attractive. But the thing is that it's different. And so part of its attractiveness is the fact that it is so alien to Western people. And this is what drew people to it in the first place. Now, we have contact between ancient India and like the ancient Greeks and stuff like that in the Alexandrian times. But I would focus the interplay of Buddhism and Hinduism with Western esotericism. I would mark that with the 19th century. Colonialism is bringing in new ideas into Europe. It's bridging all of these kind of massive distances that had never existed before. Colonialism is creating these trade networks, which is just bringing all of this information back to Britain, back to France, back to Germany, and so forth. And people like Helena Blavatsky, for example, are studying this stuff. They're looking, the universities are opening up departments for Sanskrit, the study of Indo-European languages. They're trying to find this kind of great common ancestor between the English and between the Indian. And in doing this, you have all of these Orientalists who are building up a discourse. They're building up a picture. And this is the Western image of what Buddhists, what Tibetan Buddhists, what Mahayana, Vajrayana Buddhists, all these different people, what they actually believe. And remember, this is only an image of what they believe. This is not an accurate representation necessarily. And so the West has to couch understanding Buddhism and Hinduism in Western terms. They have to clothe it in Western language and in Western concepts in order for it to be intelligible to us. And so we clothe these things in Greco-Roman terms. So Buddhism takes on Stoic clothes or Epicurean clothes. And we start to understand Buddhism through these lenses of Stoicism and Epicureanism, because we don't have that tradition in our own language to be able to discuss it on its own terms. And this gets even more complicated once we start getting into esoteric religion. So like Tibetan Buddhism, for example, where the concepts are just like infinitely deep. And there's just like so many branches to the way that you can think, and like these are all the hang-ups that you can get on your way to enlightenment, and like most of these are not intelligible terms in European languages, and so we have to couch those terms in terms that we understand. And a large part of what the Theosophical Society did was to try to reconcile these things. They would take these huge systems of Sanskrit religion or of the Vedic, like the Vedic texts, or the Pali Buddhist texts, or the Tibetan texts, and they would look at Jewish Kabbalah, and they would look. So basically, they're looking at everything that isn't them, right? That's where this idea of Orientalism comes from. It's like everything that isn't me is this East thing, and this East thing we're going to clump into one giant tradition, and we're going to call it the Oriental tradition. And what that is not actually what people believe in the East, but it is an image of what Western people think that people believe in the East. And then people start using that as a religion, and then that becomes theosophy, and then that has its own set of ramifications throughout the 20th century. So yeah, I would say that the way that comes into Western esotericism is through the colonial interchange of ideas, and then through Sanskrit and other Eastern linguists. They start looking at the religious texts because those are the oldest texts, so they must be the ones that are closest to the source, the original source of wisdom.
The Prisca Theologica, is that?
Yes.
Am I right is my Latin okay there?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a term that was created by Marsilio Ficino, and it very much embodies this idea of a wisdom. There is one wisdom tradition at the beginning of time that was given by God to Adam or something, and from there it was passed on through mystery initiations, and it was degraded in various forms, and then different people hold different traditions as higher forms or more pure forms of the wisdom tradition. So You have people who think that Zoroastrianism is the purest religion in terms of the Prisca Theologica. It just so happens that the people who hold that opinion tend to be Persian. You have people, and they think that the Vedas are the most ancient and original wisdom tradition, and everything else is a fallen version of that. Well, those people tend to be Indian, you know?
My dad's tougher than your dad scenario, by the sound of it.
Right,
My
exactly.
cat's blacker than your cat's the best one.
Right. And now the problem with this is that it doesn't view these individual religions on their own terms. It views them in accordance with this like globalist lens, right? It's like it's a comparative view, but ultimately the comparison is always with the inner Christian in your Western brain, the inner Platonist in your Western brain, the inner Aristotelian in your Western brain. These are the people that you're projecting onto these external beliefs. The only way that you can actually maintain the original concepts is to learn those languages and live in and think in those languages.
Well, that's an interesting point, because it's something that's been in the comment sections of my videos recently, and I've been following your work with the Encyclopedia Hermetica around mind, around the abscission, around the discovery of mind, that we haven't always thought like this. Again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, diminishing, stepping back and actually looking at the bigger picture. We haven't always thought like this, have we?
No. And I mean, the discovery of the mind, what that really means is the discovery of the projected mind, right?
Yeah.
The mind externalized outside of oneself. Obviously, like, people were conscious before people discovered mind, but whether they were aware that they could externalize what was inside of them in concrete terms, that's something that came about. It's a historical development.
So, do you think that Western esotericism has something to offer people that might be feeling lost and rootless in this day and age? And I'm not looking for ratification, I'm just interested in your thoughts on it, because it has definitely influenced me. It's not giving me something to believe in, but seeing the contiguous kind of history of the ideas and how they do flow so far back through time. The fact that we're able to communicate through it. There's people on my channel that are there because they're interested in that subject. It is a nebulous subject, which makes it exciting. What are your thoughts on Western esotericism? Is it something to believe in? Is it an authentic tradition? Am I throwing loaded questions at you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, of course they're loaded questions, but I think it's important because it inspires people to pick up really old books and read ideas of people who lived in a time that was radically different from their own and radically more difficult.
Yeah, that's a good point. Radically more difficult.
Like they say, always listen to an old man when he's speaking, but like, how much more do you listen to an old man who lived 2,000 years ago, who's still speaking, who's still around to speak? Like, there's this idea and it comes with postmodernism, and it's that, like, there are no facts, there are only interpretations, and so there's really nothing worth learning, right? Because you're only ever learning people's interpretations. But I
absolutely fucking hate that.
Well, yeah, of course. Nonsense. There are facts, and then there are interpretations of facts.
Yeah.
That's the reality of it.
Yeah, again, another dualism.
It's a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
But I think that, when you are hooked up into the esoteric tradition, you are hooked up into a dialogue of old men who have been through a lot of shit and who were the, like, intellectual all-stars of their day. You get a chance to hang out with the Einstein of ancient Greece. You get a chance to hang out with the like Heisenberg of the 12th century. All these things are accessible to you, and why would you not want to go look at all of it and try to see if you can bring it into some sort of like coherent model for you to apply that wisdom in your life? But again, it's like this kind of talk, I'm preaching to the choir, right? Because it's like the people who are already into it, they know that they can benefit from it, and they do. Yeah. And so they keep doing it. The people who, don't care, they don't care. And it's like, whatever. I'm not trying to like proselytize this stuff to people. No. I more so just like I am on my own adventure, and I like bring other people along for the ride if they're interested. But it's like, it's not a religion in the sense that I'm like, you need to be saved from yourself, and this is the wisdom tradition that will enlighten you. I don't think in that way. I think of like, there are many different wisdom traditions, and there are people who try to clump them together into one thing, and we can learn from all of them. The clumpers, the splitters, whatever. Like, I'm not the one like looking for confirmation in my own personal beliefs. I'm just trying to be an observer.
Yeah, and I'd like to make that clear. I as I said earlier on, I'm not looking for ratification. I'm just very interested to just bring these ideas and topics up for people to just digest, get their teeth into, have a listen. What would... I mean, again, I'm not suggesting this is some kind of panacea by any stretch of the imagination, but there is so much warmth and depth and goodness to be found under this umbrella term. What, if people want to go further, what would be your suggestions? Would you encourage people to look at orders? Would you encourage people to just go their own way? What advice can you give on that front, please?
I would encourage people to work chronologically. Like, I'm a historian, so I have this bias that I want things organized somewhat chronologically to see who affects who, and like what is retro projection, what is actually like things that people believed in those times, because it's like one of the dangers of the Western esoteric tradition is that everything just turns into historical goop.
Right.
And it's just like the world is just this stew of Egyptian and Greek hieroglyphics and Jewish gematria and Martians and ancient aliens and ascended masters, and you just like, you can't tell what's up from down, who influenced who. Like, that's being lost. Like, that's not a good thing. So I encourage people to work their way chronologically and read the classics. Like, read the Bible, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
Like, read it. Like, it's so important in Western esotericism, and people are so hung up on like the Kabbalion and stuff like that. And I'm like, the Kabbalion...
It was written in the 50s, wasn't it?
No, it was written in the like early 1900s, but it's representative of new thought. It's representative of theosophy and of these occult revivals that were going on in the 19th century. It has nothing to say about historical Hermeticism. And even Dame Frances Yates, even her narrative is like loaded and complicated and doesn't have that much to say about the actual history of Hermeticism. I mean, Hermeticism is a word, right? So we got to talk about the history of the word. And so I would encourage people, read the Bible. That's a start. I would encourage people to read the Neoplatonic philosophers. Read the works of Plato before you do that, obviously. The dialogues, right? The Republic, Gorgias, the Phaedrus, the Phaedo, like all of these. They're very important. And they're deep, right? Like, and they're fun. So it's not like a slog to read this stuff. most of the stuff that I talk about in the Encyclopedia Hermetica, this is kind of what I was trying to do, is create a framework for people to work through stuff. So if you want to learn about Pythagoras, for example, go and read the the lives of eminent philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, but know that was written in the 4th century A.D. So this is like 1,000 years after Pythagoras. So it's a hard mess to untangle, but I would start with the beginning, and then I would work my way through it. Like the later class, for Renaissance type stuff, I would look at the Picatrix, I would look at the Ars Notoria, the Sefer Yetzirah, the Liber Racialis, all of these kind of famous grimoire works from the Renaissance, and then on into the early modern period. You start getting people like Jakob Boehme, and quickly you start to get into the Theosophists and the people who are like Madame Blavatsky, or like Paul Foster Case, or Annie Besant, or the Manly P. Halls, that sort of thing. So I don't know. It's like, it's hard to say as a person who's kind of like done the disentangling, or to some extent. There's so much more to do, right? Like, there's always more to disentangle. But as somebody who's done the disentangling, I would tell people to like start from the beginning, as opposed to just like drop in anywhere and start from there, because you're going to have problems. My in was the academic study of mystery cults. So that was a really solid in to like Eleusis and the Dionysian mysteries, and Attis and Osiris, and Cybele and Attis, not Attis and Osiris, Isis and Osiris, Attis and Cybele, etc. Like, these were a good start for me, because they got me interested in the idea that there were these wisdom traditions. And then I started to parse them and be like, oh, okay, I see that the Dionysian mysteries are separate from the Isaic mysteries, or separate from the Eleusinian mysteries. But then you also see like, oh, well, there's a lot of like borrowing in between the two, and there's a lot of overlap. Like, where is this coming from? What are the historical factors that go into these links between various mystery cults? And that's where I started pulling on the string and untangling things. And now I have a more coherent kind of picture of who's who and what's what and when's when. I would recommend like getting into the Secret Doctrine, by Blavatsky, the Secret Teaching of All Ages by Manly P. Hall, the Crowley books, all that stuff. Like, that stuff's great. But what I would do is I would like consciously delimit it to an era, and say that like, this is the way that certain people thought in an era, and this is like the summation of a bunch of disparate factors that come together to create this atmosphere in Victorian society where these sorts of things are happening. I would not take their word for it and say that like, yeah, like I just wouldn't. And I would also not forego science. I think that people don't realize how much modern science is an outgrowth of the esoteric tradition, of like the people who were thinking about these great questions like heliocentrism, or what is the nature of an atom, or gravity, for example, by Isaac Newton. All of these people were occultists. So it's like, and I'm not saying that they came to those beliefs, or they came to their realizations because they were occultists. I'm saying they were smart people. They were the smartest people of their time, and they also believed this stuff. So let's like examine it on its own terms, instead of being like, oh, I'm a modern person and I don't believe this and that and this and that. And it's like, I'm like that, right? Like, I suspend belief all the time. I am a modern person. I am pro-science, but I also allow myself to go down these avenues and not try to reconcile the fact that some people in the past were wrong with what I think is the right thing in the present. It doesn't do me any service.
Well, it's about that neutral folder, isn't it? And that's something that Buddhism taught me, and it's one of the best takeaways is trying not to fall into a good, bad, yes, no, right, wrong, like, dislike, binary decision when information comes your way. It's keep it, store it, and don't put a value judgment on it. Keep it in neutral, because you never know when that information you're going to be proved right or wrong on it. So that very, very valuable teaching. Thanks for sharing that.
I would say also, like often a symbol that was used in the 16th century, for example, was the rosy cross, right? So you have the cross, which is a symbol of Christianity, and then you have the rose embedded in it, and that's the Western esoteric tradition, which if you start reading into the manifestos, they're like, oh, that comes from the East, right? It's like Christian Rosenkreuz went out into the Arab lands and hung out with the Sufis, and he was in with the Greeks, and he was like it's this trope of the widely traveled philosopher who gets wisdom from ancient lands. That's very much a part of European tradition, and this is this Platonic Orientalism thing. And I would say, that now that I think about it, I would say start with the Bible and start with Buddhism. I think that if you can be a good Christian and a good Buddhist at the same time, you are on a good road to becoming an excellent occultist. Like, I think that at least is what works for me. Buddhism was integral for me to as a historian. To get my mind into that space where I was feigning objectivity. That to me was like a hugely valuable tool, and that is definitely not something that comes out of Christianity, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Christianity is all about righting the wrongs, which is also a good thing, and is something that we should be grateful for. That there are people in the world who are looking to right wrongs. And obviously there are people who are not Christians who are looking to do the same thing. Christians don't have a monopoly on doing the right thing. But in terms of like observing the world, that's how it casts it. It's like, how can I fix what's broken? Whereas Buddhism is like, how can I accept what is?
I think that, again, we need to be in the middle of those two. And that's where my journey has led me, is ex-alcoholic and drug user of 15, 20 years, accepting that is part of me. There's no escaping it, but equally not giving into it and just rolling over and just letting it take me, actually making the change. And like, so are we in a false dichotomy here, or is this a duality now? I'm trying to work it out.
Well, between what specifically?
Well, between, alcohol, accepting out that I was, let's use alcoholism as an example.
Sure.
Accepting that I'm an alcoholic and doing something about it.
Right. Well, I think that, obviously I wouldn't say that Buddhists would be okay with doing alcohol, because it's
no. It's one of the precepts, isn't it, to not consume intoxicants. Let me maybe explain myself a bit better. So, you can accept that you're an alcoholic and still keep drinking. You can accept that you're an alcoholic and modify your behavior and stop drinking, or you can stop drinking but not accept that you're an alcoholic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what you would ideally want to do, and I think the ideal situation for most alcoholics, is that you can be in situations where there is alcohol and you understand that you have a problem with it, so you abstain from it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have such a control over your life that you have to storm out of the building and and be like, like people are drinking and they know that I'm an alcoholic.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Yeah, I was like that for a little while. It does.
It's a big thing in the church. It's huge because there's a lot of Christians who are recovered alcoholics and who are like trying to get out of that life.
Yeah.
And then they go and they find out that like most Christians are just regular people who want to drink beer on the weekend like everybody else. And then they're like, oh no, I thought that these people were the people I was going to hang out with who were going to be clean or whatever. And it's like, well, we're not drunks. We're not getting drunk, but we are going to have some alcohol at the party.
Is it Methodists, I think, are teetotal?
Well, I don't know. Different people. Yeah. Baptists, a lot of people don't drink, but I was raised Baptist and it was a really, like, even from one family member to another, it's a personal decision. And a lot of people just abstain because they are imbued with that Victorian spirit of prohibition that, you know, when they were growing up, when they were really young, you'd get people who their dad or their dad's dad worked at the factory and he'd just go to the bar and waste all of the family's money on getting drunk and come home and beat mom. And so it's like, I get it, right? Like, I understand that that's how you view alcohol, and so you don't want anything to do with it. But you can't go around policing other people's morality if they don't have a problem.
No, absolutely not. That's where we start sliding into, well, descent into hell, isn't it?
Well, and like busybodyism, and it's not a good time.
So if you don't mind, could we just touch on one last subject?
Yep.
Would it be a fair analogy to say that Western esotericism is paganism and that paganism is Western esotericism? Because we touched on Christianity, Hermetics, Alchemy, Buddhism, the Vedic school. We've touched on Theosophy. Where does paganism tie into all of this?
You got to remember, first off, what is paganism?
Yeah,
Paganism
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah, paganism is a word that means country bumpkin. And so it's like right there, you're asking like, what is non-Christianity to Christianity? And like, is non-Christianity Western esotericism? And my answer would be, no, it's the tension. Yeah. It's the tension between the paganism breaking out at the seams and the Christianity trying to rein it in and trying to pull it back into orthodoxy. And so the Western esoteric tradition is studying this tension without accepting that one side or another is the superior side. Yeah. You're looking at it and you're going like, okay, I get it. These people want like social order and like cohesion and like society. And then you're like, okay, I get it. These people want to be like free and they want to like practice their own beliefs and they don't want to be like forced into a mold that is not their own or a lifestyle that is not theirs. They don't want to pay taxes to some government that they don't support, like these sorts of things. And it's like, it's this delicate balance and tension and the pull and the push of how Christianity wrestles not only with itself but with outsiders of all kinds, whether philosophical, religious, cultural, etc. These are all valid avenues for exploring the Western esoteric tradition, which is why if you look at these modern 20th century efflorescences of Western esotericism, they're so colorful. Sometimes they're like absurd to the point where it's just like, let's just throw shit to the wall and see what sticks. Like this is my tree of life with like Taoism in it. And it's also got like Dante's levels of Paradiso in it. And it's got like, they just try to like smush everything together and see what fits. It's like Golden Dawn mysticism is a lot like this, where you're just like, okay, well, I don't know about that, but these individual traditions are pretty cool on their own, so I'm gonna look at those instead of like this hodgepodge of 20th century noise.
Well, you said right at the start, waste bin category, didn't you? So
yeah, that's actually Wouter Hanegraaff and his gangs. That's what they call it.
I like Wouter Hanegraaff.
I do too.
But
I don't like waste bin.
No,
it's undignified.
I didn't like the way that he was handling those precious books.
Oh, I know.
Is it Dr. Forster?
Yeah. Is it Forshaw? Peter Forshaw?
Forshaw, that's right. Forgive me, Professor Forshaw. The way he was handling those books is much more delicate. And, for those who don't know, I'll link to the Infinite Fire webinar series by the Rittman Library. Dan got me onto it, and it's fantastic. If you're interested in your alchemical woodcuts, your engravings, this is the series for you. And they've got these ancient, Renaissance books, and Wouter Hanegraaff is nearly throwing them around,
yeah.
And I'm like,
yeah,
they're having apoplexy. It's like, oh my god. yeah, fantastic series. I haven't actually worked my way all the way through. But again, I touched on this at the start, and I will finish up with this, that watching the Dr. Forshaw's explanations of the symbolism that's found in some of my favourite woodcuts, I didn't realise that some of my favourite woodcuts were, and this is where my mind is blank and I should be a better student. There was a compendium that he shows that's got some of the most traditional ones by one particular artist, and I can't think of his name now. Maybe you can help me, Dan. I don't know. Anyway, I'll find it and I'll leave a link below. But just those explanations then ratifying my own meditations on that imagery and coming to similar, if not the same, conclusions, albeit in a different way, which is so powerful. And again, I'm trying to now put into language something happening in my universe, my cosmos, the cosmos, whatever, that's ineffable and indescribable. It's very difficult, but you defragment yourself. I feel like I defragment myself when I learn and when I study this stuff and when I apply myself. And it is an application, it is dedication, it is practice, it is studying. Dan was telling me in the preamble to this how many books he's having to read. It's bonkers. There's no way I could even cope with half the amount, quarter of the amount. The hard work and the dedication definitely pays off. But going into it with an open mind and not expecting results and being humble and gracious, I could never ever have predicted the potential that is inside of me and the defragmentation of my suffering, of that cycle of samsara, has just been so profound. And so, yeah, and I want to say, Dan, you have been a big part of that. The Encyclopedia Hermetica has been such a great cornerstone to...
Well, that's good.
Start with, essentially. It puts so much into perspective, and it puts so many... It's just building those blocks in the right places. And yeah, it ties into something I've said in other videos, that when we just sit and aimlessly absorb information, entertainment, quote unquote, it just does. It doesn't free us from suffering. It might feel like it does in the moment because it's a panacea, a band-aid for suffering, but actually real release from suffering, real like meaty release, comes from dedication and study and diligence, I think, and yeah, being open. And I might sound like I'm going on a bit of a puritanical rant, so apologies if that's the case. I'm just excited, and it's been really, really good to be sitting here talking about all this stuff with you, and I'm sure our audience are very appreciative.
Well, it's what I like talking about, and I'm glad that the series has been useful to you. I mean, I put it together first it was to get my teaching chops up, but the intent for the reception was that it would give people a framework to get into this kind of stuff and try to edge people away from the really unhinged angle. Just like diving into it where everything is everything, and everybody who tries to put some semblance of sense to things is a shill and trying to destroy your worldview. I'm just like, you know, I'm not Jesus. I'm not trying to save anybody or anything like that, but I'm glad that I can help people by mitigating confusion. And I'm no authority, you know, nobody has to accept what I say. It's just there to provide a structure for further evidence. And hopefully people do it in a chronological or historical way, because it's much better for their understanding than just to, you know, jump around willy-nilly and confound everything together in one ahistorical picture of the world.
That is something I have tried to do, is do it chronologically, but I will say that I am guilty of dipping in and out of bits and pieces. The problem I have, and you know that this is the case, is that I'll listen to it and I'll fall asleep because I'd like to relax at the end of the day, and then I'm just gone. I'm into that ideal world.
Yep.
So I'll revisit things, and it is good. You can pick up odd episodes, and again, your ones on Pythagoras are excellent. The one on Zarathustra, I put my hands up to being an ignoramus, but I'd never even heard of Zarathustra up until that point. So,
well, you see, like, for that guy, like that, like, I wasn't even going to make a talk about Zarathustra because I had kind of like gone too far, and I was like, oh crap, I need to like go back and do this because this is the guy. Like, there are 3 or 4 guys that you have to talk about in a history of Hermeticism that spans over however many hundreds of hours. And it's like, if you don't talk about Zoroaster, you've got a serious problem, because in the Renaissance, that was the big debate. Who started the wisdom tradition? Zarathustra? Hermes? Moses? Which one was it? Like, and so it's slim pickings. And so out of all of those people, I was like, okay, I really do need to talk about Zarathustra. And I think I've pleased some Persian people out there too by talking about it, because they are always the ones like screaming like, oh, it all comes back to Zarathustra. And they are to some extent right. And so I got to give the devil their due.
well, maybe we could have a chat at some point in the future. I know you're a very busy man. Maybe something about Zarathustra and how it does tie into what we're discussing now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no specialist on Iranian religion, so most of the things that I know about the subject are in that lecture or in the Western Esotericism talks. And how Zoroastrianism interacts with, or perceived Zoroastrianism interacts with the Renaissance thinkers. But yeah, it's definitely something that there's a lot of debate and contention around. But again, I think a lot of people are asking loaded questions too. You know, if you're going to say who started the wisdom tradition, well, you're asking for a concrete person, and you're always going to get a concrete person. The reality is much more nebulous, right? There is one wisdom tradition that is like a jewel that is passed down from Enoch to whoever.